once we get through this, there will be plenty of time to talk about what the longer term looks like, what the future of Canada looks like, what is needed for various sectors, for various Canadians. We've seen a whole bunch of new needs popped up that we had not paid much attention to over the past years, like the plight of most vulnerable workers.
Ottawa and the provinces are coming together to increase wages for those essential workers. It's the latest measure to help Canadians during the crisis. But as you heard from the Prime Minister there, it has also exposed some real problems. So what happens after these benefits get rolled back? It's Thursday, and I'm here with Adi Shu. Chantal Hébert joins us, Andrew Coyne, and of course, Althea Raj. Good to see everybody. Let's start with that deal today between the federal government and the provinces that is a cost-sharing deal. How do you think at this stage, this crisis changed the way governments in particular view what is essential work, the people that we probably don't talk about enough who are out there every day doing those things? Start with you, Andrew.
Well, I don't know if it's been fundamentally transformed. This is a particular situation. For example, people working in the long-term care homes who are working at several homes. And we've seen that that's been at least identified as a potential problem in terms of spreading the disease. So they've been told they can only work at one. Well, that's a major cut in their pay if something wasn't done. So there are particular situations here. Also, people are facing heightened risks in the current situation. But ultimately, the wages we have a functioning labor market where we will at some point in which supply and demand will still be dictating wages. And I'm not sure that necessarily can or should change in the long run. But in the short term, we've got particular situations and particular problems to be identified. They're going to have a hell of a time trying to figure out exactly who qualifies and who shouldn't. And they've left a lot of that to the provinces. But it's still going to be, I predict, a continuing issue for them in deciding who should qualify for this and who shouldn't.
Well, and also, Chantal, it raises the issue of what happens after. I mean, you could say many of these people have been underpaid for forever. And so how do you go back to not having this top up, or does that ever reverse itself? I don't know.
I agree with Andrew that it's circumstantial and that we have a functioning labor market in this province, for instance, that was dealing with labor shortages that should have driven up wages even without top-ups. Where we go from there, I think it would be probably an error to come out of this and say, well, here's our solution for long-term care is to pay people better. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but I'm saying that the entire long-term care picture and how older people are dealt with or make choices for their end-of-life living is something that you need to look into beyond saying we should pay people better. So it's not, and I don't believe that the top up now that you take away when the situation is normal in a year would suddenly make those places deserted and without any workers. It is a particular situation.
What do you think, Althea, that this is sort of something that we just need to consider right now and it's not going to necessarily change everything?
I think there's a lot of changes that are likely to come, but I don't necessarily think they will affect, private companies' ability to pay their own workers. I agree with Chantal. I think long-term care, and frankly, the Prime Minister has said this several weeks ago, that there's going to be a rethink, that he thinks a rethink is required with regards to long-term care homes, whether that means including them in the healthcare system, and that probably means Ottawa forking over a lot of cash to include safer, stronger, public delivered services to our elderly population. I think one thing that has come up very clearly is that we rely so much on workers who do make minimum wage to ensure our health and safety. You think about the people who clean office buildings, who clean buses, who clean hospitals, who clean grocery stores. You think about the food processors who are working basically sometimes shoulder to shoulder, who are not making much money, who often are vulnerable themselves, who may be workers from other countries who come here to work. I think that, in addition to things we've already talked about, like the welfare gap, how is it that Ottawa says $2,000 is what you need to live on, where most welfare payments across this country are less than $1,000? I think that is going to cause a rethink, but it may not necessarily cause a rethink in provincial capitals and in Ottawa. I think the country as a whole is recognizing that a lot of people are in precarious job positions.
What about the other thing that came up around this these benefits this week, and that was Andrew Scheer, who talked about the potential that the cap of $1,000 that you can make if you apply for the emergency relief benefit in some way is discouraging people from going back to work, and that there needs to be some sort of progressive change to the CERB. What do you think of that, Andrew? Is that a conversation that it needs to be had and needs to be had right now?
It's a conversation that needs to be had at some point. It's hard to talk about that right now because there's no jobs for people to go back to. It works in the short term in this emergency situation where we're not concerned with whether people have work incentives because there's no jobs to go to in the short term, and where we're not concerned with the long run cost of it because supposedly this is only for 4 months. But if you're talking about a program for the longer term, people talk about this being the genesis of a guaranteed annual income. Mm-hmm. In the longer term, you want to have much more gradual taxing back of benefits as people start to earn income. If you do that, that means it costs a lot more money, which means you either have to start at a smaller base benefit, or you have to start talking about what programs this replaces rather than just ladling it on top. And if the minute you do that, you start talking about the provinces. So there's a lot of steps you'd have to go before this program enacted for an emergency could be translated into a permanent long-run income where you do have to work about things like incentives for work.
Is that the concern then, Chantal? Do you think that the Conservatives are expressing that this is going to be turned into some sort of universal benefit?
I'm not clear on what the current concern that the Conservatives are expressing really is, in the sense that we will have conversations about issues like that afterwards. But at this point, there are too many uncertainties to say this program needs to be rejigged. As Andrew pointed out, it's a temporary program, 4 months. This program needs to be rejigged because it's discouraging people from working. Well, in hot spots for the pandemic, larger cities, Toronto and Montreal, to name just two, those jobs that their Conservatives are talking about are just not happening. They don't exist. The rest of the country is about to open up, and I don't think very many people are going to say, I can live off for another 2 months at $2,000 a month and not take a job back because this is so great. So I think it's a premature conversation. I also don't think that emergency funding is a solid foundation to rejig social programs in this country.
Althea, about 30 seconds to you.
I don't think the money is the issue. I think the fact that the CERB is $1,000 that allows you to earn $1,000 and still collect CERB is an incentive enough to go back into the workforce and keep collecting CERB. And if you're making more than that and you don't want to go to work, it's probably because you're afraid for your own health rather than money.
One of the things that we're very much thinking about is how do we build back better? How do we look at what this pandemic has challenged us with, what it has highlighted around needs or gaps in Canada, and how do we look to rebuild and recover in a way that advances us in the right direction? Obviously, less pollution, greener outcomes are going to be a part of it, more digital, more connected is going to be a part of it, better supports for vulnerable Canadians and more equality across this country needs to be part of it as well.
That's the Prime Minister answering a question a little bit about how we move forward, what the future looks like, how you deal with massive deficits. The answer to me struck me as interesting because it almost sounded like some language that you might have heard for someone who was outlining an agenda to go and seek a mandate to do some things that weren't on the table in the last election. And I realize that I may not be the only one to think that, and that it also may be crazy, but I did want to try and get you guys to weigh in on whether that is even in the realm of possibility, given what we're living in. Chantal.
If you're talking about an election next fall, no, I don't. I'm not part of that school, even for entertainment purposes. It's not clear that we're going to be out of the pandemic by then. If this sounded like a Liberal platform to go into an election, I would totally agree with you. And if you suggested that this time next year we could be in an election, given that we would have put the pandemic behind us, I would also not be totally surprised. It is totally possible to build a narrative to say the last election took place in another world, and someone needs a fresh mandate, and here are the options for going forward. I don't think that's happening in the fall.
Yeah, and I should say, it's not something anyone is talking about in any real way, from what I can tell, the conversations I have. But it is something I think everyone needs to consider, including us. But it is something other parties need to consider as well. And it sort of speaks to your point last week, Andrew, that you talked about here and that you wrote about, and that is the Conservative race starting in a different place than where we are now. And it does sort of give some credence to that argument that the Prime Minister was talking about there, about how you move forward and whether you need a different government or you need an opportunity for citizens to weigh in on what that looks like.
Well, yeah, well, let's be clear. It'll be governed by one consideration only, and that's, can they win? So it's not about needing a mandate or the public weighing in or any of that. It'll be, where are they at in the polls? What kind of message can they put forward, and can they get away with it? So if they could get away with it in the fall, and if the things looked propitious for them, they'd do it. And I think they'd be even prepared to push the envelope in terms of people squawking and saying it's too soon, it's unfair, or whatever. But more likely, as Chantal says, since we don't know what the situation is likely to be like in the fall, we could have a second wave of infections by then, for all we know. More likely scenario is next fall, probably after a budget, when they are still in the rosy glow where they can hand out money, like nobody's ever seen. And we're not yet into the mode of, well, how on earth are we going to pay for all this? So they'll still be seen, as they are being seen now, as the saviors of us all. They're now 19 points ahead of the Conservatives. And if they can start to shape that and frame that into, we're not just doing stuff for the long term, for the short term, but we have a long-term vision of the post-pandemic society, then the spring would be a good opportunity for them. And yes, you're absolutely right. That absolutely puts a premium on the Conservatives figuring out what is their message, what is their contrary proposition. Is it just, no, don't do it, or is it, here's what we would do instead? And the party needs to do a lot of thinking about that.
It also has to happen before there is any sort of serious, intense post-mortem on what the government did, I would think too, Althea, because that would be potentially damaging to them, although we don't really know that now. I'm not sure I would conclude anything right now.
No, I think that is too early. And I think that is probably what makes going in the fall like a nice fodder for opinion columnists. It is very tempting when you're at 44% compared to 25% for the Tories. So obviously there's a reason why we're talking about it, but is it likely? No, absolutely not. Especially when you think that Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, has spent the past 5-6 weeks telling us to stay home and to keep away from one another. How would we go to the polls? It would just not be sane public policy. Could it happen next year? Possibly. The problem, though, is that so far, Justin Trudeau cannot argue that he's had a rough time getting his agenda through the House of Commons. All the political parties have given their blessings. The Bloc and the NDP are unlikely to want to go to the polls, and so they would support his agenda. So the only option he'd have would just basically to go to the Governor Generals and say, to make that pitched, I need a new mandate, and I need to go to the electorate to get one. And she could very well say, well, go face Parliament and see whether or not you have the confidence of the chamber. And so I think that in order to have an election in a very short time frame, you would have to have the blessing of the Governor General.
Okay, Chantal was desperate to say something. So
yes, 2 words. I've seen many minority governments go after a year and a half, 2 years, and no one, and I have yet to see in this
would be 1
modern
year.
era. But a year and a half in those circumstances, I can't imagine a Governor General suddenly creating a constitutional crisis by refusing to drop a writ.
She's allowed to do it. And she should.
Yes, and
that
that's
would be
why,
the appropriate thing.
Okay. And that's why no Governor General has ever done it. The other thing I wanted to say, more importantly, everyone is assuming that Justin Trudeau really wants to be around for another 5 years.
Yeah, but he could start another 5 years and not finish.
I'm just saying.
Yeah, I'm just saying. Okay. And I will also just say there are other places having elections 4 years, like the U.S. That has to have one no matter what. So, it can be done. All right. I knew that you'd all have interesting things to say about that. Thank you all, Chantal, Andrew, and Althea. See you next week. Thank you.
Okay.